usually you get back a lot more when you are in that mindset and you take those kind of risks and you're basically being intimate with your fellow man. Hi, this is David Lloyd, and you're listening to Expansive Intimacy with Jim Young.
Welcome to Expansive Intimacy. I'm your host, Jim Young, and I'm on a quest to help men like you and me discover how to apply intimacy to unlock new, expansive versions of success in your relationships, your work, and your life. With each episode, we'll take another deep dive into the intimacy toolkit to show you how you can enhance your emotional intelligence, leadership abilities, and relationship skills. So settle in and open up, because it's time to get intimate. Hey folks, welcome back to Expansive Intimacy. I'm your host, Jim Young. And I had a friend of mine tell me years ago, never to meet your heroes because they will only disappoint you. Now, growing up, I was always a huge sports fan, and one of the jobs that I envisioned myself in one day in the future was to be a sports reporter on TV. And a couple of years ago, I met one of those heroes. I met this guy who is an ESPN SportsCenter anchor, and I thought, oh my God, this is going to be amazing. I'm just going to get to ask him all these questions about what it's like to be a SportsCenter guy. And then I met David Lloyd, who has been a SportsCenter anchor since 1997, a graduate of Colgate University with a degree in international relations. He says he's still trying to figure out how to apply that to giving highlights and ball scores. And while David and I talked about his television career, which started with, as he calls it, the longest unpaid internship in Macon, Georgia, WMAZ, we didn't stay on sports for very long before we started to get into other conversations. And in fact, on the show today, we might touch into sports a little bit. But I think we talk a lot more about the things that matter in life. David's had some amazing experiences in his life that include his job, being a sports reporter in Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, and Sacramento, and San Diego, and eventually returning to his ancestral homeland in Connecticut to work for ESPN. Some cool stuff there. But some of the stuff that we really get into stems from David's life as a happily married guy who's a father of 3 amazing kids. And it's really cool to peel back the curtain on somebody who you imagine as a hero and to not be let down. David also wants you to know that he can do the New York Times crossword puzzle. So he's not just a talking head about sports. He's got a lot of smarts and a lot of depth. Let's get him onto the show. David, so good to see you. Thank you for coming on to the show. I'm excited to explore expansive intimacy with you.
And I'm kind of honored, Jim, that you would think of me. In fact, I told my wife, Deirdre, that hey, Jim invited me to do a podcast, his podcast, Expansive Intimacy. And she kind of has this strange look on her face. She goes, well, what do you know about that? I'm like, I don't know. I'm not an expert, I don't think, but maybe I am. So I will be happy to share whatever perspectives and opinions and thoughts I have on the
and
subject.
You can let Deirdre know that this is a learning experience for all of us, including me. And so as we always start on this show, we'll ground it in your definition of how do you define intimacy?
My knee-jerk reaction to that would be, okay, how touchy-feely you are, how much you hug and kiss and tell people you love them and all that good stuff, which I feel like I'm pretty good at that part. I'm sure there's a component of it which has to do with sharing and vulnerability and allowing people to see your good, bad, strong, weak sides. And The Who has one of my favorite songs called Eminence Front. I don't know if you know that song, but it's basically about, we've all got a mask on all the time in public. And so seldom do we sort of show who we really are. And I think I've gotten better at that as I've gotten older. But then sometimes you kind of fool yourself because you think you're being open and honest, but oh no, maybe I'm just showing that side of my personality or that side of who I am. So I think revealing yourself, your true self, is about as intimate as you can get.
Eminence front is a put on, I believe, is the exact lyric.
Oh, man. Look at you with the lyrics. Yes.
You've tapped into one of my grooves. I'm a music guy at heart. And it's that put on. We're putting on some kind of persona, some kind of mask to show people who we want to be seen as, I think is one way that we commonly go through life. And I know I've done it in many different ways, and revealing ourselves, as you said, that's actually part of my definition of, in the book that I wrote by the same title, Expansive Intimacy. I define, it's actually a really long definition. There's no way I could even memorize it, but it's about revealing our true selves and who we are at heart. And also, as you named, like, the touchy-feely side, like we have emotions, and there's also this physical component, and there's all of these different ways. And I'd love to start with maybe a place where some unexpected intimacy maybe has shown up in your life. I know we've hung out a bunch of times, and I know you have a child who went through some pretty serious medical issues early in life. And I imagine there were some trying times, there were some close times. And I'd love to just, for any listeners who've dealt with or are dealing with that kind of situation in their life, to see where can intimacy show up in a moment like that, and what can that do to help?
Well, I would say this. So my youngest daughter was diagnosed with a brain tumor when she was 4 and needed emergency brain surgery. And we were told by the doctors, you're all set. We got the whole tumor. You're going to be good. And then 3 months later, it came back. And so we started doing chemo and all of that stuff.
Can I just back you up to the start of that for just a second? That news had to have been life-shaking for you and your family.
You're not going to believe this. It actually came as good news, Jim, because we had got a misdiagnosis that she had a progressive disease. It's called AT. Immediately we Googled it, and it was just horrific. Basically, you're dead by the age of 16. You lose your ability to walk and talk. And so that was the sort of the death sentence that she got. And then about 2 weeks later, we discovered that was completely wrong and that there was a brain tumor in the back of her head. So as scary as a brain tumor is, and obviously it's a terrible thing, it actually came as like a thunderbolt of good news. It meant we at least had a chance that she was going to survive.
A serious roller coaster there for a few weeks.
Oh, awful. And I mean, you want to talk about just being stripped down. I mean, I can remember a moment where it kind of dawned on me, maybe 24 hours after Deirdre told me that she had been to the doctor, and they said Eden has this thing. And, immediately started researching it. And you're in the mode where you're trying to find out everything. And then you find out everything. And a few hours later, it settles on you like, oh my God. And I was in the kitchen with Deirdre, and I just remembered this just god awful feeling. I don't cry often, but I just broke down. I didn't care who saw me. I didn't care how it looked, whatever. It was just an awful feeling. And from that place to where we are today, that was 11 or 12 years ago. I'm filled with gratitude that she's doing great and the chemo worked, and she's, a healthy 15-year-old girl. So it's a great ending to the story. It was an awful period in our lives, and the trauma that spreads around from something like that, like, Deirdre and I tried to hide it from our children, and you can't hide that. I mean, it's one of those things. You think you're doing a good job, but I don't know how, subconsciously the stress is radiating out or whatever it is. But everyone is impacted by it. Everyone in your nuclear family, that's for sure. So I don't know if that's intimacy, but we're all this organism as a family, and we're all kind of picking up what everyone else is feeling. So while we're showing it a lot, or trying not to show it a lot as the parents, and the kids sort of assimilate that, and it's a tough moment. So I don't know if that's intimate. I'm not sure I'm answering your question correctly, but it certainly is a life-shattering moment in a lot of ways.
It certainly sounds like it's one of those things that breaks you open to a new way of realizing what life is and how fragile it can be and what matters. And I hear like some really appropriate, I want to protect my other kids who, your other two kids are older. And so they're at different ages. They could maybe understand a little bit of what's going on. And I would assume they also could read like, hey, something's going on. Mom and dad are acting different here. Mm-hmm. There's some intimate knowing in that space for sure.
Yeah. You can't hide. You try to hide it and you do your level best, but it gets out no matter what kind of a front you're putting on. And, I think in a lot of ways it's made us closer as a family, but there's been negative parts to it too. I mean, this is not a fairy tale. You have trauma in your life, and unless you deal with that, it does stay with you in a lot of ways. So when I was a teenager, my sister, who was a year younger than me, the closest person to me in my life, she died of bone cancer. So this was sort of like this awful experience happening all over again. And I remember at the time, my sister's name was Susan, that I pretty much judged everyone on how they reacted to what she was going through. And a lot of people, Jim, as you know, certainly as a teenager, were not very good at dealing with that kind of stuff, with grief and death and all that. And so a lot of my friends just, kept it at arm's length, couldn't deal, almost sort of disassociated themselves from me. And I kind of at the time took a pretty harsh view of those people, which was completely unfair of me. I mean, I was sort of in crisis as well, but it also, in a lot of ways, put me in a sort of a headspace that the people that were there for me, there's something special about those folks. And my best friend ever since is a buddy of mine named Scott. And he didn't think about himself at all. So you sort of, in those kind of moments, you start to think, how is this going to feel for me? He didn't think that way. He just jumped right in, and, he would escort Susan on the train to Mass General up in Boston. And, he would take me out and make me feel better. He was there every step of the way. And that's sort of formed a relationship that we have today, where I know where his heart is and he knows where my heart is. And that's a great thing when you have a friend that is that close and you have zero doubts about who they are as a human being. We were talking before this about one door opens and another one closes. It's like, it was an awful thing, and it still is an awful thing for me, but there was good that came out of it.
Mm. I can only imagine the depth of relationship that you and Scott must have from that shared experience, and really being seen as, I am struggling with this best friend, my sister, this person who cares, who matters so much to me. And you're seeing me, and you're seeing my grief and my pain, and being there to show up in so many ways. You've just described 2 points in your life, decades apart, where you had to deal with some really traumatic events and to deal with grief. I would imagine in multiple ways. Certainly your sister's loss is a huge grief, and one that we commonly think of as a grieving time is when somebody dies. I think there are smaller grief processes that we go through when something isn't the way we expected it might be. Maybe that showed up with Eden's tumor and her condition. I'm just curious, what have you learned over the years about how to grieve? I think as men, we're not often invited into that space in our culture to grieve and to have sorrow and to process those things. I'm just curious, like, what those experiences have shown you.
Well, when it goes back to Susan, I just, cried and grieved as openly and nakedly as you possibly can.
Yeah.
And And I think that helped me in a lot of ways, actually. I mean, I was a mess for a good long time. I actually was in college at the time, and I was living in a fraternity, which may be the worst place in the world to go through the grieving process, because those folks are not, their mindset is not trying to help people, hold someone's hand as they're going through all that. They're down in the basement drinking beer. I guess I was in touch with my emotions, or whatever you call it. I really, had an awful time, but because I did, I feel like I was healthier in the long run than maybe some others who weren't able to express those emotions as readily as I was. And that turned out to be like a good thing for me, that I fell apart, because in the long run, I feel like, okay, I got it. I got a lot of it out. Maybe I didn't get all of it out, but I got enough of it out that I was able to have a sort of a healthier view of the world and of her passing than I would have if I hadn't. And I got a lot of that trauma out of it.
I didn't know that story, but that makes a lot of sense to me. And you can tell Deirdre, this is one of the reasons why I asked you on the show, is there's this clear range that you have around being able to be open and be able to talk about what's real. And I think that's some of the space that gets created when we allow something big like that can get stored up in us, to let it out. I'm just going to be a mess for a while. I'm going to allow that.
I want to share a quick little story about my son, which I think he wouldn't mind me telling. I think Dugan, you know him. He's got a kind heart. And my father died when I was 5 years old. And just a couple of years back, we were back in my hometown of Westport, and we were driving, and my father's cemetery was just near. I'm like, hey, Duke, you know what? I want to take you and show you what your granddad's, grave looked like and whatever. So we get up there, and I've been there many times. Obviously, he had never been there, and we're just sort of kneeling by his tombstone, and Dugan's looking at the dates. And my father died about 2 weeks before my birthday, and he noticed that. He's like, "Oh, he died on June 8th, and your birthday is June 21st." I'm like, "Yeah." In fact, he was going. My dad had tickets to take me to my first baseball game, and for my birthday. And I couldn't, he couldn't take me. So my grandfather wound up taking me instead. And I hear Dugan kind of sniffling a little bit. I'm not looking at him. I'm just looking at the tombstone, and he kind of is as well. And he started, I'm sure, thinking about his dad, and he loves baseball. We've gone to a bunch of baseball games together over the years, and it just hit him. And I didn't say anything at the time. He started to cry a little bit, and we got back in the car and pulled him back close to home. We pulled into a Dairy Queen and had an ice cream. And I said to him, "Dude, I know you were a little emotional back there, and I just want to tell you that you may think, at your age, or teenage or whatever, you may think that's sort of weakness or something." I said, "That's not. That's strength. To be able to experience that and to have that in your heart, that is a beautiful thing. And don't ever, ever feel embarrassed or ashamed of that kind of emotion, because that is a great thing that you have there." So,
wow.
Yeah. That's one of those things as a dad, generations of fathers and sons. And that one really got me.
Yeah. And as a dad, I know that sometimes it's the car ride. That's when you get the opportunity. You see that moment arrive where it's like, oh, we can have this deeper conversation. And that he maybe invisibly or unconsciously made the invitation for you by letting his emotions out graveside, and to then be able to come back and say, yeah, hey, dude, this is important stuff. I love that. Thank you for sharing that, especially like there's that, 4 generations involved in that story.
Yes.
Your grandfather and your son. And, how men can, kind of change over time, how we can actually talk about these things. And I see, your son is about 3 or 4 years older than my son is. And I see in that generation this greater capacity for dealing with emotions certainly at that age of life than I ever had when I was at that age. I'm curious, are you seeing that also with your son and his friends?
I think so. Yeah, I really do. I feel like since that moment, he's been a little bit more, as you get older, you're going through your teenage years, you start to get a little bit more solid footing in being an adult and a man or a woman or whatever you are. And I'm seeing that more with him. Can I just tell a little addendum to that story, which is way off our path?
Absolutely. Here. It's expansive. Let's go.
Let's expand this conversation. So that game that I wound up going to was a Mets-Pirates game at Shea Stadium back in the day. And before the game, so I've never been to a baseball game before. Before the game, they're doing this thing where they hit the ball and the teams were on the field, but this was not the game. And they threw the ball around the bases. And it was a triple play. Like they were sort of, and I asked my granddad, I'm like, what's going on? He goes, I think what they're doing is there must have been a triple play yesterday and they're showing the fans what it looked like. So I've got this in my head that somehow, which doesn't make any sense. Like they're not going to do that the next day. But as a, what was I, 5 years old or whatever. So I carry that around for the next 40, 50 years. And then I read this clip in a newspaper that there was a scene from The Odd Couple with Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon.
Uh-huh.
And they needed to get a shot. You remember Oscar Madison from The Odd Couple? He's the sports writer. So He must have been at the stadium and there was a scene. So it was an actual scene from The Odd Couple, the movie, that I was witnessing. And for some reason, for 50 years, I thought it was, they were pantomiming a triple play. So anyway.
That's amazing. Well, I was thinking something different because, maybe you planted the seed for your future career. It's like, before back in, I'm guessing this is what, like 70s, early 70s, something.
I wish it was the early 70s.
Late 60s.
This is like 1967.
67.
That's how old I am. Yeah.
So before there was something like SportsCenter, how did you show people what a triple play looked like live? You just had to read about it in the newspaper. Maybe there was a grainy footage on your local TV station. So, maybe they're like, hey, we did something awesome yesterday. Here's
yes, let's show it to you. Like. Yeah,
we'll show you a few times too.
We'll get both teams to go back out on the field and do it. Yes,
that's right. We'll get a couple different angles. And so of course I would be remiss like if I didn't ask you about like spending so much time in that world, because I've shared with you before, I've got this theory that there are a few different ways that men in our culture comfortably access emotions, which is a portal to intimacy, and it's music, sex, and sports in no random order or whatever order that is. And so I'm curious, like being around large scale sports, professional major league sports and athletes for a long time, does that ring true? Like, is emotion more allowed in the sports world?
Define your terms. Obviously when you're on the field of play, I would think, of course, yes, there's a tremendous amount of backslapping and hugging and high fiving and all that good stuff.
Which is one of the ways, right? So like that's a form of intimacy. We all need physical touch. And as men, there aren't a lot of places that we can get physical touch, certainly not from other men in our culture without, putting our manhood at risk seemingly. So, slapping somebody on the back or putting your arm around your teammate or tackling somebody if it's football, right? So that certainly qualifies. But I also hear language. I'm a big sports fan. And so I'm reading and I'll hear about, I was reading a story about Keontae Johnson, the basketball player, just graduated from Kansas State. He had a medical issue on the court years ago. And this tweet that went out from, I forget who was the coach or something, and saying like, we all love him, right? Even just saying those words, like, I love him, I love you. It seems like we allow that in the sports world in ways that we don't in other places.
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely. I didn't really think about it in those terms, but you are allowed to call someone that he's my brother. I love that guy. And I'm not saying that a lot about my coworkers, in a professional world like we are, but on a sports team, I don't know I don't know why that's sort of okay, and it's not in other realms of society. I would have to cook up a theory on the spot on that.
Well, what about sure. in your experience as an athlete? Because I assume you played some team sports growing up and through, whatever age, as did I. What did you experience in that, in those settings?
I can't remember feeling like love. I mean, now listen, I was just a high school wrestler and, played baseball growing up and football and stuff like that, but never made any further than that. I mean, there is sort of this group mentality, which is a beautiful thing. But as a kid, you're not, I don't know, I guess I didn't think in those terms. I love being with my teammates, and it was a great bonding experience and all that. And I guess if you wanted to put a fine point on it, we were probably, such a cohesive unit that there was some love that we were sharing there. I thought you were going to go in this direction. I thought you were going to say that being able to talk sports is a form of intimacy, which I was getting ready to wrestle with you on, Jim, because to me, men just, the typical male is not as good at sharing things as a woman is. That's just my belief. I mean, we're just not for whatever reason, we're not hardwired as well as women are to share stuff. And a lot of
or socialized. I would also
socialized. Okay, so and a lot of our conversations tend to go to a very safe place, and one of those safe places is sports.
100%.
And you can put 6 strangers together in a room, and you can usually find a common thread about, either you can talk about the weather or you can talk about sports, and it's not religion, it's not politics, it's nothing dangerous, and it's sort of a social lubricant. But in the same vein, it's also, you don't ever get anywhere. Like you can. I've heard you recite, the Celtics teams from the 1980s, and
absolutely,
it's fun, and but you're not learning really that much more about the other person or experiencing that much more about the other person. So, and for myself as a sports anchor, I can't tell you how many people come up and that's all they want to talk about is sports. And while I love sports, I get my fill of sports every day at work. So it's not my number one favorite topic when I'm not working. I do love sports anyway. You and I can talk sports all day, but if a stranger comes up and wants to know, who are they going to take with the number 3 draft pick? That's not particularly a great topic for me. I don't relish those kind of conversations. So that's what I was thinking you were going to say. What are your thoughts on that, as far as how men speak to each other and where you find the common area to sort of grow and find out more about each other?
The first thing I'll say is that when I was a high school athlete, it's not like I had this insight of I have emotional bonds with my teammates. So I just want to clear that. I was right on the same page with you. I might have somewhere deep in my being loved my high school catcher, Brian Allard, because he could really catch the pitch. He framed pitches well, and he knew what pitch I was going to throw. And so I always loved throwing to him. But I never that was not at the surface level for me. One of the things that I think is what you were describing. I can get together with lots of guys and we can start talking about whatever sports, because I've been a sports fan of all the major sports for a long, long time. So I can jump into a conversation about basketball, about football, a little bit of hockey even, and baseball, oodles. And one of the things that does happen in those conversations, while it is what I like to call an above the fold or a headlines kind of relationship, all we talk about is kind of the day-to-day stuff, nothing deeper. There is a skill that's going on because we do express emotion. We do talk about how we feel. We we think that, we're so mad at the GM because he didn't pull off the right trade, or we're so sad that that player is retiring. I think it's a place that men can practice emotional language in a safe place. And I agree that you're right, that it only goes so far if you just keep the content around sports. And I think one of the first, when I first met you, my partner Shelley has been good friends with you and your family for years, and she said, "Oh yeah, we're gonna get together with David and David Lloyd. You might know David. He's a SportsCenter anchor." And I was like, "Oh, I think I've seen him before." And I was kind of like, "Cool, I'm a sports fan." And I know we talked a little bit about sports. I was more interested in like your career and how you got there. And what I appreciated so much was that, yeah, we talked a little to sports, but there was a lot more. And I want depth of relationship. And so I think it's I think it's actually a really cool space to explore for guys who are like, yeah, I want deeper friendships. Because that's one of the things that keeps coming to me in my work as a coach. Guys come to me and I ask about their social life and it's nil. And they're trying to figure out, how do I develop friendships? Well, we got to get below the headlines if we're going to develop, like you and Scott, right? You had that deep emotional bond at a really early age based on a traumatic event. And now you've got somebody for life. You've got a brother. And so I think that there's a way that we can be practicing that skill and then taking risks to go into another content area and say, how did you navigate that transition in your life? How's it going in your day to day? What's, we're not going to jump right to feelings, but I think there's a bridge to be built there.
Well, you're good because I think I'm receptive to having deeper conversations, but you are, I don't want to use the word aggressive because it's not really aggressive, but you are proactive about going there. And so you kind of led me there. Like you could have been, Joe Sixpack and you wanted to talk about the Patriots. And I'm like, okay, I'll while away a couple hours with this guy, Jim. But you very quickly sort of, set the environment where I felt like, okay, I can go there with this guy and we can talk about some meaningful things.
Guy that I had on the show several episodes ago, Nico Booston, a friend of mine, I picked up from him, like, somebody has to go first. And I mean, I think I have been for longer than I've known Nico, but it kind of really crystallized that. And this is relatively new. I'm in my early 50s. I probably started doing that in my mid 40s. I realized the reward on the other side of that risk is like, wow, you're a really interesting person. Like, I don't think I would have gotten that if I'd just been asking you about like, what's it like to be on ESPN, or what do you think about the Washington Wizards trade, or like fun, topical, interesting, momentary stuff. And getting to know you as a person is so much richer than that. And there's just so much more to explore.
Absolutely.
I do actually want to jump over to part of one of those first conversations we had when you first got into broadcasting. I think that's when you were also starting you had met your wife and you were starting a family. And I've heard in different conversations we've been a part of together that you and your wife Deirdre had almost like opposite schedules for like a really long time. Can you just lay the foundation for that?
Yeah. Well, not only did we have opposite schedules, when we first met, we were on opposite parts of the country. She was in Chicago and I was in Sacramento, California. And that went on for a couple of years. So we met on this one crazy weekend at a friend's wedding, which turned into a whitewater rafting trip. And there were all sorts of misadventures involved with that. But that was just one weekend. And then we're 2,000 miles away again. And we sort of had to decide right away, do we want to give this a go? I certainly did, and she did as well. So we did the long distance thing for a couple of years, and I didn't have a lot of money, and Deirdre was a student, so she didn't have any money. So it was sort of hard to get back and forth. You'd save up money and, fly every 2 or 3 months.
Yep.
So that was a long thing. And then
pre-internet days.
So we spent a lot of time talking on the phone, and which is kind of a joke now because she knows I do not like talking on the phone. I can, I'll call my mom every week for 10 to 15 minutes. And it's, I'm not gritting my teeth. I like talking to her, but I do not like talking on the phone. So, but we would spend an hour and a half every night talking on the phone. And those are the days when they used to charge you for long distance. So that was a thing.
Yeah, those prepaid calling cards and stuff.
Yeah. But you're right. As far as the schedules were, television, sports, the schedules are all over the place. And for, I'd say 15 years, I worked weekends. I worked nights. Now I'm on really early mornings, but back then I worked a lot of nights and a lot of weekends. And Deirdre was a teacher. So she'd be working Monday through Friday. And we had this sort of system where we'd sort of scribble down, notes to each other. You wouldn't text in those days, right? So it'll be a little piece of paper and you'd write
texting texts.
Exactly. You'd write a little endearment and, I left a casserole in the refrigerator, whatever it might be. And one of the best gifts I ever gave Deirdre was I started secretly, saving these notes, and I saved them for a year and then put them together in a book. And we have it. It's called Notes to Ourselves, which is sort of a takeoff of a poet I used to like called Notes to Myself. But so anyway, every once in a while we'll go look through and you can just, there might be like a tomato sauce stain on one of the notes or whatever. But awesome. They're all sort of there, and you can sort of get a sense of what our life was like and the relationship and the times and all of these little, isn't that what makes up life, is just sort of the little insignificant stuff every day that you go through. And so I love looking at that thing. So anyway, that's sort of how we stayed intimate, if that's the right word to put there.
I would say so. And first thing is, I didn't know you make casseroles. So now I'm going to request one the next time we get together.
I had a thing called the sour cream noodle bake, which is now mocked mercilessly by my kids. They won't eat it. But back in the day, that was my favorite thing. It was very simple.
The other thing I want to shout out from that story is something that I describe as experiential intimacy. And it's this like whitewater rafting after this wedding, like this crazy adventure that you went on that wow, so much clicked in this really short time because we were just in it. And it could be there's so many different ways you can have experiential intimacy. It's oftentimes a wonderful way to kickstart or re-kickstart a relationship. That story about the notes, though, that to me is really the gist of it, because that's got to be really challenging, right? You were working, different schedules. You were raising young kids. I'm imagining kind of like a high five relationship, like we see each other on the way in and out the door, and to have the presence of mind. First of all, the discipline to continue sharing in these little notes, these little moments of endearment. The everyday drip of intimacy. And then the other part I didn't know is I didn't know how much of a romantic you are. Because oh man, guys, if you're listening to this, find your version of that. If you want to bring your woman closer to you, make that book of notes, because she's just going to swoon. I have to imagine that was, actually tell me, I don't want to imagine, when you handed that book to Deirdre, or she opened up the package, what was it like? What happened?
Oh man, you're asking me to go back in time here. I think it was a big success. I know by the amount of times we've gone back and looked at the book, it was a big success, and we both sort of cherished those notes. It wasn't my notes to her; it was our notes back and forth to each other. So it was sort of a gift to myself as well. But yeah, I am. I'm quite a catch, Jim, as you know, and I'm a great. But it was a joy to do it. Actually, I was sort of having fun with the whole concept. So
yeah, we all can now go to our phone and look at a text thread and see the last 2 years of back and forth notes with somebody. So that seems to be not as valuable anymore when you have to work for it, when you have to take those actions. So I just love that as a creative invitation for people to find really simple moments where intimacy is built. Because I think that's exactly where it's at, is everyday moments where we take the care, we take the time to be with somebody, to reveal ourselves, to be seen, to show them how much we appreciate them. I think that's where it's at.
Yeah. I always feel like it's not the huge firework moments and buying someone diamond earrings or whatever. It's sort of how you pay attention to the little stuff. And so I think we're both pretty good at that. And it's certainly worked for us.
Yeah. Well, David, I would love to offer you any parting thoughts or anything you just want to share about what people should know if they're interested in what you do in the world, or anything that you want to just lift up for for what intimacy might mean.
I was going to actually tell this story. I have this poker game that it's like my favorite night of the month, and we've been doing it for 20 years or so. And it's like maybe 8 guys, rotating group of 10 or 12, but 8 guys can show up every night. And maybe 15, 18 years ago, there was a friend of mine, not a close friend. And so you can imagine a poker game with a bunch of guys. It's the subjects are very jocular. There's not sharing. There's not intimacy. There's none of that kind of stuff. We're giving each other a hard time, and we're gambling, smoking cigars, and drinking beer. There was this one time, this complete, never happened before, never happened since. This guy, this friend of ours, started talking and then started bawling at the table. And he was telling us that his wife had just asked him for a divorce. And it was an incredibly awkward situation, because these are some guys, some of them are good friends and some of them are just sort of poker buddies. And like I said, we don't really have any ground rules for dealing with real life stuff. And so the poker game came to a screeching halt, and people, were trying to say nice things, but they weren't doing it very well. And the poker game kind of broke up at that. It kind of, it ruined the darn poker game.
You and your feelings.
Yes. But anyway, it was this guy and myself. Everyone had jumped in their cars and left. We're standing in this guy's driveway. And I just I looked at him, and that expression, oh, he looks like he could use a hug. Well, this poor guy, I think not only was he just heartbroken about his wife, but I think maybe he was a little embarrassed that we didn't sort of give him what he needed or something.
He took a big risk there.
He took a huge swing. Absolutely. And maybe it was the wrong crowd to do it in, or he didn't get what he was hoping for. And I just took a look at him. It's just sort of, there's no one else there anymore. I just sort of walked out 10 feet between us. I walked up and I wrapped him in a big hug. Mm-hmm. And for a second, he kind of stiffened. We don't really know each other like this. And men don't usually do this. Yeah. And then all of a sudden he started hugging me harder than I was hugging him. And it just, to me, it was like just a great lesson in, if we can get over ourselves a little bit and be kind to other people. And while he took a big risk, I felt like I was taking a big risk by going up and hugging the guy. And you take risks all the time in how you approach strangers and friends alike. And I am, I'm in awe of the way you go through life in a lot of ways, Jim. I don't do it like that. And so you were to be commended. But if I had to leave anybody with any thoughts, I would say that is usually, as you said earlier, you get back a lot more when you are in that mindset and you take those kind of risks, and you're basically being intimate with your fellow man.
And maybe to close with some classic rock lyrics to bookend Eminence Front, in that story you told about the guy at the poker game, you can't always get what you want, but sometimes if you might find you get what you need. And it sounds like that hug that he got from you in the driveway is probably exactly what he needed that night.
Yeah, hopefully. So,
David, thank you so much for coming on. Even with your doubts about how much you could expand on intimacy, you absolutely had some amazing stuff to share with us. And
I'm going to tell Deirdre about that. All right. Yeah. Now, I had no preconceptions about what our conversation was going to be like, but we certainly went in some places that I didn't even know we were going to go in. And I appreciate you listening to me, Jim.
Yeah, well, that makes 2 of us. And thanks again. I can't wait to see you again soon.
Okay. So long.
Hey guys, it's Jim. Thanks for listening to the show. If you're enjoying these episodes and are wanting to bring a little bit more of those relational skills into your work and your life, get in touch. I keep a couple of slots open for one-on-one coaching with guys to help them develop their emotional intelligence, their relationship skills, their leadership ability, all so that they could live the most successful and happy lives possible. Just email me at jim@thecenteredcoach.com and we can have a short call to see how I might be able to help you. Hey, thanks for tuning in today. I really look forward to seeing you next week on Expansive Intimacy with me, Jim Young. I'd also love your help with expanding intimacy even further. Would you take a minute right now to rate the show and write a review? It's the best way for us to bring more people into the conversation. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.